So as we mentioned, South Africans made their choice between a record number of 48 political parties on the 2019 general election ballot. It was the sixth time since the end of apartheid that they had the right to decide which political party will guide the nation's decisions. So today we speak to the top three, their policies, track record, public opinion on their performance and trajectory for the future. We've tackled the governing ANC, as I mentioned, the official opposition DA, and now we speak all things EFF, which was founded in 2013. In 2014 elections, the party received more than 1 million votes and 25 seats in the National Assembly. It's driven a policy that seeks to reverse the legacy of apartheid and colonialism, campaigns which have drawn flack from some quarters. The Clicks protest being the latest. To speak more about this and other issues, we're joined now by the EFF's Deputy President, Floyd Shivambu. A very good evening to Mr. Shivambu, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Well, evening, Tsepiso, and evening to viewers of SABC.
So obviously, you've been in the news of late. Your action around Clicks, the protests around it, some of which turned violence, and there was vandalism. Do you think the end result that you have, the actions have resulted in sustainable, meaningful, systemic change?
Well, it cannot be systemic change in terms of defeating racism in its entirety, but the message that we wanted to send has been sent very clearly, because our purpose of engaging in those protests is inspired by one of the founding principles of the EFF, that we must move from reconciliation to justice. There's been so many stories that happen around racism, including with the transition of South Africa from apartheid to the system that we have now, which is economic apartheid and some political rights for black people. So we then are now saying as the EFF that when people are engaged in racist activities, they must face consequences. There must be real consequences. There must be justice against racism. That is why we took to the streets. We went to all the stores of Clicks to stop their operations so that they can have a proper system that will bring to justice the people who dehumanized black women. And that is what basically will define our struggles moving forward, that there will never be a racist action that will just be resolved by just a mere apology and sweeping these issues under the carpet. So there must be consequences for all racism.
Let's talk about that, Mr. Shivambu. What were the demands and concessions that were made in the Clicks negotiations? Because as some of our viewers pointed out, by the way, we asked this question on Thursday, some of them pointed out that they actually don't know what happened behind closed doors. What were you forced to back down on?
Look, one, we wanted both Clicks and Unilever to come to the acknowledgement that that image which was flighted in the website of Clicks was a racist image. And they came to that conclusion. They admitted that. They expressed remorse. That is why, as part of their remorse package, they committed to donate sanitary towels and sanitizers and even scholarships to black young women from particularly rural areas, because that is the position that we said, that you must acknowledge that this is racism and there must be action that must be taken against everyone else that is involved in the production of such an image. And in the case of Unilever, they indicated that already the director who was presiding over that has resigned from Unilever South Africa, has left the country. And also in Clicks, there was a believable presentation that there is a consequence management of all the people that were responsible for the flighting of that particular racist image. So we were then saying that that is what we demanded in the first place. You remember that prior to us engaging in the protest action, we wrote a letter to Clicks to say that please take action against the people who were involved in the production of that racist image. And they gave us a very believable assurance that such is being undertaken. And that is what we were demanding. So we think that it's a victory, because it's also a lesson to many other institutions that since the formation of the EFF, we are not going to be engaged in racism and just apologize and it's just left like that. There has to be real consequences for everyone else that is involved in racist activities. And that is the modus operandi of what we're going to engage in all the racist manifestations that are going to happen.
So, Mr. Shivambu, let's talk about the racist manifestations. So the term, obviously, white monopoly capital has become very much part of our lexicon. Do you believe that the prefix of white, a monopoly capital, really disrupts the structural economic inequality?
Look, the reality of the matter is that what 1994 brought was just political freedom without economic freedom. What that meant is that the white minority who illegally and unlawfully and immorally gained too much wealth continue to be in ownership and control of South Africa's wealth today. We still experience economic racism in South Africa. We still experience economic apartheid. And at the center of that economic apartheid is a white minority, very few individuals who monopolizes majority, if not all, of the industries. So very few things that get to be distributed in the economy are owned and controlled by the white minority. And that is why we're diagnosed white monopoly capital as the primary enemy for the struggle for economic emancipation in our lifetime. Because if you have got wealth that is concentrated in the hands of very few people, that inevitably is going to cause high levels of inequality, high levels of poverty, and even the jobs dividend which everyone else is looking for will not be achieved because these white minorities are not interested in the collective development of the entire South African society. They are only interested in profit maximization. So the white monopoly capital is a reality, is not a fiction. Even in statistical economic terms, if you go and check who just controls the supply of virtually everything, of food items, of logistics, of transport systems, of the banks, is few individuals and few corporations. Majority, if not all, are controlled by the white minority. And that is why we still have to characterize the phenomenon of our problems as white monopoly capital. That must be defeated so that we can.
And I ask this question, Mr. Shivambu, because some of the questions have been raised, they're granted, and I absolutely appreciate the historical contextualization thereof. But they're saying we have the Chinese, other countries rather coming into South Africa, literally performing land grabs, not in the strict sense of the word, but of the corporate kind of land grabs, the taking of resources, importing skills, denying our people skills here. So there are people who are asking questions, why not attack those sectors, those interests?
Look, Tsepiso, in statistical based terms in South Africa, the control of the land is still in the hands of the descendants of the colonial murderers and rapists who took our country by force. That is a reality. So even in the Surveyor General report that was issued in 2013 by the Department of Land Affairs, it's a clear illustration that the people who continue to own 80% of the land are the descendants of the colonial settlers. And of course, there's a China phenomenon which needs a dynamic analysis as to whether China's participation in South Africa's economy will have a developmental dividend. It will not be like the colonial or neo-colonial form of investments that has characterized the West since colonialism and even after the end of apartheid, where the West is just coming to take our mineral resources and bring them as finished goods and products. That is what we want to discontinue. That is why we say in the economic freedom fighters that we need to pursue massive protected internal industrialization. We need to localize our industries who must produce the things that we consume. So if you were to check the top 10 exports from South Africa to the world, it's raw semi-processed products. And the top 10 imports from all over the world is finished goods and services. And that is not sustainable because what it effectively means is that we're exporting the jobs which otherwise we're going to deal much more decisively with the poverty challenge that defines South Africa.
So
that's a reality. But the fact of the matter is that the white minority, the descendants of colonial settlers are still in control and ownership of South Africa's economy, inclusive of the land, inclusive of the banks, inclusive of the chain stores, of virtually everything. They continue to control the wealth that they got through colonialism and apartheid, and that must come to an end.
So the last figures that I checked, and I must admit I don't have the very latest, but it said, according to the JSE, that 50%, I think, of total market capitalization on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is being held by international investors. Now, given this type of sentiments, you might say alarmist, according to some, the way that the EFF has been branded, not only as radical, violent and dangerous, but if you are out there looking for votes from the electorate, whom are you looking for them from? And is race an issue? Would they buy into the ideologies that you are espousing now?
So the so-called international investors that dominate the Johannesburg Securities Exchange is basically domestic capital that delisted from the JSE and went to list in the London Stock Exchange, in the New York Stock Exchange. So if you check the biggest companies in the JSE, it will be Naspers, which is primarily a company which was created by the Nationalist Party, and it's led by Koos Becker, who is here in South Africa. But then they're counted as part of the international investors because they've now externalized through these loose exchange controls in South Africa the wealth which otherwise is South African wealth, inclusive of Anglo-American, inclusive of Remgro, which is owned by the Rupert Empire. All of those companies, when they come back, they then take a posture of being international investors. But otherwise, the wealth of South Africa, inclusive of the wealth that is illustrated in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, is domestic wealth, which had been externalized for a variety of reasons. Obviously, when they did not have a trust in a black government, majority of them delisted from the JSE and went to list in different areas. But the fact of the matter is that international investors always adapt to domestic decisive policies. So if they know that in South Africa, there is nationalization of the banks and of the mines, there is expropriation of land without compensation, they will have to adapt to that. They do business in countries which have got far much more radical and clear policies. In China, no one is allowed to own the land there. But China is the biggest recipient of foreign direct investments in the world now. In China, the state can take wealth or companies from private individuals for public interest and for public purposes, but they continue to be the biggest destination of investment. Of
because we are running out of time.
We just have to be clear in terms of what we stand for, and then we'll be able to then align everyone else who wants to come to South Africa to our interest. You must remember that.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and I do need to ask you two other questions. And I'd like to talk about SANEF's recent comments condemning comments made by Mbuyiseni Ndlozi on the harassment of an ENCA journalist, Nobesuthu Khejana, saying that his statement about the incident was misogynistic. He tweeted that I don't see any harassment here, merely touching her is not harassment. The touch has to be violent, invasive or harmful to become harassment. Now, given the current climate of gender-based violence, do you believe these comments are appropriate?
Look, I like the context of what I know is that since the EFF called the National People's Assembly of the Economic Freedom Fighters, we took a correct decision that ENCA must not participate in EFF activities, in EFF programs, because they've taken a political posture. They're a political organization. Their role is to de-campaign the economic freedom fighters everywhere. So everything else that they do is not genuine. I'm not aware, I don't have the details of what happened in the Western Cape, but I know that the national chairperson of the EFF correctly said that ENCA cannot participate in an EFF program because they've since excluded themselves and we treat them as such. If there is wrongdoing from amongst our members, there must be action. If there is harassment and it's genuine harassment, which whoever is crying about, let there be consequences in terms of that. The EFF does not promote gender-based violence, will never approve of harassment of even
Do you
our
think
enemies.
Mr. Ndlozi's comments were appropriate, though?
So that is how we handle that particular question.
Were Mr. Ndlozi's comments appropriate?
I'm not aware of the comments that you're talking about in terms of that context.
Okay, I would have wanted us to take up that tweet and show you, but
in terms of the official position of the EFF is that NCA does not participate in EFF activities.
Just a final question.
We never physically assault anyone when they come and participate in
Just
EFF.
a final question. COVID-19 and campaigning, raising funds for your campaigns, do you foresee any difficulties, or do you think this is a ripe period for you to net votes given the current climate?
Look, you will know that even during the lockdown period, the EFF programs on virtual platforms continued with political education, with a very impactful and clear program on women that we conducted during the month of August. So we're engaged in terms of that particular program. But in terms of funding, whether there was lockdown or no lockdown, the EFF does not have any significant external funding. We rely on public funds, which we account for in Parliament, which we always say we open our books for. So there's never been any issue of funding that would be affected, whether there's lockdown or no lockdown. But the organization continues to exist and will continue to grow, will take power and remove these puppets of white monopoly capital in South Africa.
Deputy President of the Economic Freedom Fighters, Floyd Shivambu, thank you very much for speaking to us. So let's unpack what Mr. Shivambu has been saying to get his insights on the discussion. Professor Somadoda Figeni, political analyst, joins us now. So, Prof, you've been listening into that conversation. The fundamental question is, has the EFF gone too far, or is it merely applying much needed force in ensuring political, economic and social redress for frustrated voters?
Well, I do think that what EFF has done was to take a very simple view, which has an appeal to a majority of people, translating things such as economic transformation, redress issues, which bigger parties have pronounced on, but have not insisted on. So this in itself has won them some constituency. And some of the people who may not even be comfortable with the EFF as such, some of them do like the pressure they are applying, because the mainstream at times doesn't necessarily apply that. But there is also a downside to it. Some of their methodology and style, like the one you pointed to, which Dr. Ndlozi actually uttered, they often get them into some kind of trouble, and they find themselves in a very awkward position that sometimes contradicts their own policies. And the issue of the attack, which sometimes get into politics of personal humiliation, does create some sensitivity and discomfort among the would-be supporters, but who may not actually be very happy with the tactics. So in terms of influence, EFF has done well relative to its size. But in terms of approach, the style and the tactics, at times, that has in itself created some challenges.
And I want to ask this question, is the problem the militancy of the ideological policies that they're espousing out there, not necessarily new, but certainly how they find expression from the EFF, which some people say they find threatening, they've even been labeled counter-racist. So is it how they find expression, or is it the militancy of the policy proposals?
I doubt it is the militancy of the policy proposal, because that in the main is what your Freedom Charter, your Pan-Africanist, your Black Consciousness movement would have been aspiring for. They are simply rekindling that. But the style, the approach, and the politics of spectacle at times, and the politics of personal humiliation becomes one of the challenges. Of course, on the race debate at times, they would have to refine not necessarily losing radicalism, some of the approach, because at times it is basically good in terms of the race politics and the discourse on that. Otherwise, in terms of the broader ideology, generally it has an appeal. It is the style that is the problem.
The post-apartheid economy has clearly failed, especially a lot of young people, of which the EFF has a lot of support from. But certainly for the majority of South Africans who would have thought that by now things would have begun to equalize somewhat. And I wonder if the governing party itself has opened the door for the EFF to apply this kind of militarism, because as I think it's Professor Sampi Terreblanche who was pointing out that the mineral energy complex and their influence on some of these economic policies during the negotiations, that they are the very same complex that still wield power in policy decisions now.
In fact, I do think that the EFF has come in at the time when the liberation movement, which has been in power, was failing to translate political power into economic and social power, which is the crux of the matter. So that waning of the hysteria, of the euphoria for liberation and people becoming despondent, the country becoming unequal, and the ruling party losing some ground in terms of legitimacy, accusations of corruption and so forth, has created a space. On the other side, it created a space for the DA, even though the DA now is having its own internal challenges and identity crisis. And on the left, it created a space for the EFF because the unions, the other alliance partners were still having, challenges, still embroiled in the ANC factional battles. And that in itself is one of their appeal. And that extends to the global environment where the mainstream political formations, which are capturing the majority of, constituencies, when they fail to show political will to do things which they have promised in their policies, the anti-establishment forces normally gain traction and they gain in power. So that is what we are seeing here. It may not necessarily grow into a majority in the immediate future, but at the same time, as a pressure group or even a party that is growing, and which, if you still have challenges with the DA, might even grow into a main opposition party.
So I want to talk about the radicalism when it comes to white monopoly capital, which Mr. Shivambu was saying earlier on, that, it astounds him that people are offended by that when many of white or established capitals, the firms that have benefited from the apartheid racial economy still do. So you can't talk about structural reform and not focus on the people who still have the economic power. In fact, to borrow from Reverend Al Sharpton yesterday, who was saying that the political classes are there to ensure that they protect the economic classes. So are people feeling uncomfortable because so many years down the line that we have failed to restructure the economy and those that benefited still do? So is it wrong to refer to race when speaking about monopoly?
Well, to me, I don't think there is anything particularly magical about that, because in the liberation lexicon, that is exactly what was there. But in the effort of trying to reconcile the notions of rainbow nation and national unity and so forth, such language seems to have been added away, de-racialize it and so forth. But the reality on the ground is that you still have apartheid geography in terms of the distribution of wealth. What you have seen with some of blacks ascending, it's not a deep structural transformation rather than them assimilating to the existing structure. And that is where the problem is. Even when you do have the notions of state capture the debate within the ANC at times with the factions, it's not about the wrongness or the rightness of state capture, more than to say we were trying to use this particular group to establish an alternative power to existing state capture. And that in itself is quite problematic. That's why those coming from outside say this is still the original structural problem, might still have action within broader community.
Prof, thank you very much for your time and your insights. Professor Somadoda Figeni, political analyst, unpacking for us the economic freedom fighters and their political trajectory as they also prepare to head for the elections, looking for that mandate to govern South Africa.